Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are continuing our discussion on dye and modern painted textiles. So here on screen we will start the discussion with this fragment that we have, and it's a half of a canopy or a wrapping cloth, and as I have already introduced this in the earlier lecture, this comes from the collection of Bhanu and Jivak Parpia, an extensive collection of Indian textiles, historical Indian textiles, and a lot of them were displayed in 2023 in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And here we have one of the textile pieces from their collection, and here what we see, this is half of a canopy or a wrapping cloth, and this kind of cloths also sort of make us think about the use of dye and modern painting, because if the discussion sort of gets into the temple hangings are the ones which are much more painstakingly done, or if there are narrative pieces which are hand painted, but then the pieces which are used for wearables or pieces which are sort of used as utilitarian items, for example a wrapping cloth or a tent hanging or a canopy and things like that. So those things are usually printed, but then the ones which are patronized by the temples or the royal court and so on, those ones will be painted because of the kind of the modes of patronage and everything. However, looking at this kind of textile also sort of questions this kind of preconceived notion, because this textile that we have here is entirely hand painted. It does not mean that the blocks were not present, but the thing is that here we find that there are specific reasons, and again this is very contextual, for which these textiles perhaps had been hand painted. And here we see again that there have been use of templates and perhaps stencils for the repetitions that we have. So here we have a semicircular pattern, and here we have how this certain kind of motifs are incorporated and repeated over time. So this is something we find that this kind of semicircular pattern, or if the entire textile was available, we could have seen that it was a circle in entirety. Now this kind of motifs, which is also called as Konya chakra, and in which we find that there is a circle at the center, and then in the square or rectangular textile there are motifs at the corner, and so those kind of textiles are usually seen as bedspreads. Sometimes we also see them as shawls and wrapping cloths and etc. So this is this strategy of using a motif, a center motif and then the corner motifs, is something that is very much prominent in this utilitarian textiles. However, a lot of times the utilitarian textiles, and especially in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, in Thailand and so on, we see a lot of this wrapping cloths, the ones which are worn around the body, are also very ritual specific, and the ones which were produced in parts of southeastern India where they held high value among the communities in Southeast Asia, and those were reserved for particular rituals, and not only just for particular ritual but also for the people of high social status. So in this cases again we see that there is this blurring of the boundary between what is utilitarian, what is a non-utilitarian or ritualistic, but also at the same time that the idea of the narrative paintings, the figurative narrative paintings being only hand painted and the utilitarian items being printed is also blurred and questioned by a textile like this. And in this textile what we see that it is entirely modern painted and then also resist dyed, resist painted, and in this case there are a lot of architectural motifs that we see, and especially in the borders, and in this cases like in this square sections, in this panels that we have, this continuous panels, and then the panel is divided into the small square areas, and in which we see either circular or sort of this diamond shaped or this diagonal square shapes, whatever we call them, that they are there, and the circular flower patterns, or perhaps those are lotus patterns, those are also there. So which are very close to the kind of perforations or the windows we have in temples. Also they are carved on stone. Now we see that how those kind of elements from the architecture are very prominently and also profusely incorporated when this kind of activities are done. Now this is again sort of makes us question that how many kind of overlapping that this textiles held, and the way in which we understand today a lot of those divisions which are created in the scholarship, that the idea of ritual, the idea of secular, the idea of painting and printing, and all those different kind of things, the idea of utilitarian and non-utilitarian, all of those things are sort of questioned by a textile like this. So the understanding of hangings and their relationship to architecture and temples is something we see them to be prominently displayed in the way in which both this dye painting traditions of Western India and Southern India had flourished. So in the Western India we find that of course that there are two kind of case studies we will be looking at today, and in the Western India what we have is this very prominent practice of making matani pachedi, and this matani pachedi is again this kind of this painted cotton cloth and dye painted and modern painted cotton cloth, which is used for which is predominantly used by the Wagri communities, and the Wagri communities, they are in the historical times we do see that how they were considered to be not part of the mainstream society. They were considered they were also not considered to enter the Brahminical temples, and thus the reason we find that slowly how they have sort of come up there with their own makeshift temples, and in those temples this kind of temple cloths were displayed and worshipped. So this cloth becomes the central object of their devotion, and how the ritualistic practices of paying homage to the great goddess had figured around making this cloth. So the Wagri communities, we find them to be there in Gujarat, and a lot of them we find them to be situated in the Ahmedabad region and other parts of Gujarat as well. And in Ahmedabad we see the rivers Sabarmati, and by the river of course that a lot of this dye painting traditions we find them to be closely associated with the availability of flowing or running water, and that's the reason we see them to be closely associated with the rivers in this region. So if Sabarmati is something, Sabarmati is the river we find that is crucial for making matani pacheri, then for kalamkari making we definitely see the prominence of the river Swarnamukhi or Kaveri in that regard. Now as we see that the Wagri communities, we see them that they have historically been the laborers, the nomadic communities, and they have also worked in the agricultural field. However, they were not landowners, and as I have mentioned that they were nomadic communities, they had their settlements usually outside of cities and towns, and then as we have also mentioned that in terms of the social hierarchy, they were not allowed to enter the Brahminical temples, and perhaps this kind of divisions that we have in our society that also sort of compelled them to come up with their own shrines of worship. So the shrines they have as part of their sort of makeshift settlements, historically the shrines were also kind of an extension of their homes or the places where they lived, and in those places we see the use of textiles as part of their devotion, and textile being something that is foldable, that is washable, and something that does not really require a lot of arrangement for carrying them around, we see that how for the nomadic communities this kind of textiles could usually, eventually be very useful strategy for keeping their devotion intact from when they are traveling from one place to another. This is also something we find in a number of traditions where probably not textiles, but other mobile objects are used. For example, the painted scrolls, which are usually sort of rolled and then carried with the storytellers or the different community members. So in this case, what we see that in this permanent temple setup, this temple cloths are produced, and again the most basic colors that we find them utilized in this Matani pachedi would be black, which is derived from iron and jaggery solution, and then also red, and red is usually obtained from this mordant painting. So mordant is usually applied on the fabric, and then from that we have that how that is washed and developed in madder, and today it is primarily alizarin, and through which this red is obtained. So this black and red is the combination we see them to be primarily sort of incorporated in making this Matani pachedi, and so this is something we see them in this temple hangings, and in which we see a prominent figure of the great goddess, and the prominent figure would be seen somewhere around the center. So this is not completely in center, but like in the frame here, and in which we see that how this image of the great goddess is shown, and the scale of the goddess is much larger compared to all the other narrative frames that we have. So this Matani pachedis are also framed within this prominent borders, and here we have representation of a river or water body, and then on the top of that we have a boat like setup in which there are flags, and then there is also this architectural motif to show there is a shrine like structure in this boat, and where the great goddess is enshrined. And then in the rest of the area we have this horizontal registers kind of making this marks in this entire narrative plane, and there we have images of devotees or the attendants who are greeting the great goddess, but also there are other gods and goddesses figures that we have here. In Matani pachedi today we see that profuse use of block printing is also incorporated, and when I say that today we see this, it does not mean that in the historical time block printing was not incorporated. So painting and block printing, these two are also simultaneously seen in Matani pachedi making. So in this case we also see something that there are certain goddesses, perhaps like if we understand the great goddess to be some form of goddess Durga. So in Gujarat and parts of western India we find the festivals of Navaratri are prominent, and during this time the great goddess is worshipped. But then the great goddess is also worshipped in other parts of the Indian subcontinent, but then there are also some of the other goddesses we find them to be featured by the Wagri communities. For example, the Melody Mata, and Melody Mata is someone who is associated with dirt, with untouchability. So we can see that how the Dalit communities and then their association with this idea of untouchability has also figured in their idea of the goddess, and then the of course this differentiation and the restriction from worshipping or practicing their ways of devotion in the Brahminical temples had also sort of made the way in which this images of this community specific goddesses have figured. And then we also see that how making of this temple cloths have also sort of been steeped into this history of resistance by the communities who are usually overlooked or suppressed. And so this is something we find, that how different aspects of Matani pachedi making has figured and continued in Gujarat. And when we see that how this is different in southern India, the temple hanging making, this figurative narrative temple hanging making, is something that is closely associated with the Brahminical Hindu temples. And here, for example, the ones which are produced in Srikalahasti. So here is one image from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and this is perhaps it's a temple hanging from Srikalahasti from the 19th century. And looking at the style of execution, one can clearly see how the continuation of this style is still there in the Srikalahasti region. And something we can also closely associate this way of making this lyrical figures and not really angular bodies, and then the movement, dynamism, and of course the eye for ornamentation in these figures is something that can be seen also in the Armenian hanging that we have already introduced in the earlier lecture. So it's kind of like we can see that across religions certain kind of aspects of image making had continued. However, a lot of times we see them to be very contextual as well. So for example, here we have the conventions of making figures or conventions of dyeing and modern painting is also sort of combined with the specifics of Hindu iconography. So for example, the one that we have here, it's a temple hanging in this rectangular one. At the center stage is very prominently framed, and here we have the Hindu Trinity, and that is Lord Brahma, then Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu at the center. And the iconography is something that is very striking here. So for example, Brahma is also featured, Brahma is featured in the color red and with the four heads to suggest that the iconographical traits of Brahma. And then at the center stage we have Shiva Nataraja, and Shiva Nataraja is someone who is also considered to have fair skin, and that's the reason we see that how his body remains undyed, and that is how the color of the cloth features here as this fair skinned god. And then at the right side we have this blue or the dark skinned god Vishnu, and here again we see that how the four-armed god is featured here with all the iconographical details, and that is how we can make distinction between them. And all three of them are sort of enshrined in this the temple structures, and the temple structures on the top here, they show the details of the architecture which are prevalent in this part of Indian subcontinent. So these are some of the architectural aspects, and then the iconographical and aspects we find them there, and not only in terms of execution of different motifs and objects, but also the use of modern painting and also undyed areas for featuring the skin and everything of these gods, of these god figures. Now what else we find there is that there are again this horizontal registers all along this temple cloth, and again this temple cloth is framed within this elaborate border, and those have this lotus motifs and continuous lotus motifs which are bound into this creeper like pattern. And then within that we have those horizontal registers, and within this horizontal registers we also have vertical kind of demarcation for perhaps like making separate episodes within the this narrative fragments. and this narratives a lot of times they derived from the Hindu great epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, and also from other sources, but which are usually known. Now, in this epics we also find that there are certain kind of variations, the regional variations, those are featured, but then usually what we find this the way in which these narrations are portrayed, in which either architecture or human or animal figures are prominently displayed and not really landscapes. And in this case we see the architectural depiction or the figurative narrations are associated with Telugu script. So, the script and the inscriptions, they describe the events which are taking place in each of these frames. So, this is also something we find, and the scripts are usually featured here with all these frames. So, they also seem like continuous with the continuation of these images. So, this is something that also says that how these temple cloths are perhaps utilized during different kind of performances, and during performances if the storytellers speak about this epics, and then they show that how one thing led to the other, the next episode, and then the text guide the storytellers, as well as it is used for clearly communicating these different episodes to the viewers, and that is how this temple cloths are utilized during certain kind of performances. Now, the temple cloths, they might also have been associated with architecture in another different way, and that is for making the temples on the move, and the chariots. The chariot processions are something that we find them to be also there as part of the Brahminical temples in southern India, and there are yearly rituals or celebrations during which we see that certain chariots are taken out of the temples, the prominent temples in southern India. So, here I wanted to just focus on one area, and that is around the area in Tanjavur and Madurai and in Tamil Nadu. So, what we find today in the Madurai area and some of the other parts of Tamil Nadu as well, that when the chariots, these wooden chariots are taken out for processions during particular seasons and particular occasions, then the Utsava Murti or the metallic icons are also placed in this chariot, and then the chariots are profusely decorated with applique cloths. Now, this applique clothes, if we see them, then this clothes are definitely not something that we can consider them to be directly connected to dye and modern painted fabrics. However, if we see the way in which the applique clothes are incorporated in these temples, and then the way in which the applique, the perhaps like a resonance of this applique clothes are already present in the dye and modern painting, the way we see in the left side of the screen, where K. Lakshmi Narayan, the Salamkari painter from Kadupur region, from Sikkarnaikanpet in this Kadupur area is displaying one of his paintings. It also shows something that perhaps that this way in which we see that applique being a different technique, and then this modern and dye painting being a different technique altogether today, perhaps this traditions were connected in the past, and that is how this elaborately decorated temple chariots which have featured in this, which have featured in the yearly rituals of prominent temples in southern India, they were not really something that is disconnected. So, modern painting and again applique textile making, perhaps there are connections between them, and which requires further research to explore. Now, thinking about the way in which this idea about the ritualistic, and then like also the more sort of understanding of the secular hangings have featured. So in that regard, we have some of the hangings and a large group of this Matani pachedi hangings, and the hangings which are made by the Wagri communities, they are there. Almost around 70 Matani pachedi hangings are there in the collection of Sarmaya Foundation in Mumbai, and this is one of the images from their collection, in which we see there are a range of auto rickshaws, and this auto rickshaws, they occupy the center stage of this image. And again, this very characteristic black and red combination is utilized here, which evokes this ritualistic past of these hangings. However, the images, they completely depart from the way the ritualistic Matani pachedis are produced. So this is a contemporary Chandarvo, which is produced by Sumit Chitara, and the Chitara family is one of the prominent families now today practicing this Matani pachedi in the Ahmedabad region. And here what we see, that Sumit Chitara is this this young artist today, and who comes from the family where Matani pachedi has been practiced for generations. However, we see that in Sumit Chitara's work, new motifs have come up, the motifs from the contemporary society that we have, different kinds of auto rickshaws, and the auto rickshaws are then associated with different kind of ornamentation, and their similarities and differences. The kind of ways in which we were talking about how the repetitive motifs are featured in this dye and modern painted textiles, and repetitive motifs not always make us think about that, its particular use as being wearables, but then how that this kind of hangings, they question the way in which repetition is incorporated, dye and modern painting is there, but then also at the same time this idea about utilitarian and non-utilitarian textiles are sort of brought into conversation. So in this image, what we also have is that of course that Sumit Chitara and his contemporaries would also popularize their images over social media, and that is how they kind of garner a wider reach, and by looking into topics or themes which are not specifically relevant for the Wagri communities. Even though the kind of Matani pachedi hangings and everything, they have a wider reach than the community members today, and a lot of the this Matani pachedi hangings are collected as collectibles by different collectors and institutions, but this kind of images also sort of add to this idea about what is ritualistic, what is secular, at the same time what is non-utilitarian, and so on. So with these things, we see that how there are some of the discussions, and perhaps this kind of discussions also fold into the ways in which the neoliberalized market since the 1990s have featured, and then the craftspeople were exposed to different kinds of market systems, and thus the idea between this strictly ritualistic works and the secular works have been blurred, and people have been experimenting more and more with this. However, if we take these ideas further, or perhaps if we push these ideas back in the history, we find that perhaps this context specificity of making textiles were already present if we see the early modern textiles as well. So for example, the ones we have already studied, so the one in the left side of the screen, even though this is it is a primarily an utilitarian textile, it features hand painted, painstakingly made images which are repetitive, but at the same time those can also be closely connected to the way in which the temple hangings are produced. So the way in which we see this juxtaposition between secular and religious, the way we see the juxtaposition between utilitarian and non-utilitarian this dye and modern painted textiles which were there in the early modern period is something we also see their resonances today as well. So, when we are considering the history of dye and modern painted textiles, perhaps these are some of the areas we need to understand them, that instead of making this kind of divisions, we need to understand the contexts in which they are produced and what kind of utilization of tools and techniques the artisans have incorporated, what kind of exploration of the fabric and available dye stuff people have sort of experimented with for achieving certain kind of results. Thank you.